this week, everybody, I feel like, just assumes that watching the Bengals last night makes you feel really good about your team, and I feel like the Jets are in that class. I feel like everybody just assumes like this is a bye week for Philly.
Well, yeah, and you got to be careful about that. I think that's the most dangerous part of this week. We always talk about the NFL, and maybe there is a little bit more disproportionality from the best and the worst than there typically is. Usually teams can jump up and bite you a little bit if you don't take them seriously. I don't know if the Jets are in that category. They might be in that category, the healthy Sam Darnold, but even if he does play, he's not going to be himself, I don't think. He's certainly not going to be 100%. So it does look good on paper, but got to be careful. You got to play these games. You can't it's not Alabama against Furman. You can't just chalk it up before it's done.
Furman's a good pull by you. Sports Bash 97.3 ESPN. Let's dive into what you wrote about today to kind of start things off and the cornerback situation in Philadelphia. Did we learn? I know you said Wednesday we should get more. What are they off today? But has anything kind of emerged at that spot, which I guess is one way that if Darnold ends up playing, that's one way the Jets can maybe get you is if you're banged up in that area.
Yeah, you could look at it either way. You could look at it like the healthy corners, when the best corners, when they are healthy, are not performing. So maybe rotate in other guys, and maybe they perform a little bit better. So you can take a look at it that way, or say if these guys aren't good enough to beat out what had been playing so poorly, it's probably only going to be getting worse. I think, we've talked about the lack of pass rush. There was another stat out today that the Eagles have the sixth best pressure rate in the entire league, if you're one of those advanced analytics people. So what that tells you, what that tells me, I'll tell you straight off the bat, it means you can't take away the quarterback's first read. And if you can't take away the quarterback's first read, that's the corners. That's not the pass rush. That's what the corners are expected to do. And then when you have to get to that second read, that's in theory when the pressure gets home, and you would generate more sacks. So I think if you're looking at the Eagles defense as a whole, these cornerbacks have been the worst part of it, and it hasn't been good.
Yeah, I asked the guys a question earlier in the show about if you could get a top-flight end or secondary piece, which is a more pressing need. What would you say?
Well, just from what I said, from the numbers, it's corner, and it's really not close because they are generous. And I know that's hard for people to understand because sacks are such an important part of what people look at, and they don't have any. So it's tough to understand. But if a quarterback doesn't have to come off that first read, he can get rid of the football in 2 seconds, and it doesn't matter how quick you get there. If he can't get rid of the football that quickly, that's when you start piling up the sacks. Every quarterback that has played the Eagles generally doesn't have to go past his first read on a particular play.
John, we've all seen what the secondary and the defense as a whole has done production-wise through 4 games in the 2019 season, but I asked this to Mike and Jeff earlier as well, and what can we expect from the secondary and the front seven and just the unit as a whole moving forward? I know you're going to say to yourself, well, I just answered that question, but it's a matter of, are you feeling like they escaped that game against the Packers with that bend but don't break mentality, or do you feel like that could potentially be a trend to get them through the year and get them where they want to be? Or are you looking at it like, man, after this game against the Jets, this could be trouble?
No, I don't think you ever escape against Aaron Rodgers and Lambeau. If you win, you earn it. And any way you can get out of there with a win, especially when you fall behind by 10 points early. I mean, his record was 58-0-1 as a starting quarterback. So the fact that you're able to get out of there with a win is almost unbelievable. So, hey, by hook or by crook, however you do it, and maybe it was a PI at the end of the game. Who cares? You get the win, you take it, you're grateful for it, and you move on. I think as a whole, look, when the guys come back, whether Sidney Jones is able to play this week, he'd be the only one in the mix. Ronald Darby's going to be out for a couple more weeks. Vontae Maddox is going to be out for a couple of weeks at least. When they are all healthy, they almost have to improve. They're not going to keep up. There's a demonstrated performance level there that, while it was overrated, I would say, by a lot of people that follow the Eagles, it existed. They weren't this bad by any stretch of the imagination. So I don't expect that to continue. I don't think it can continue. So I do think it'll improve, but if you're talking just the bend but don't break mentality, I mean, unless you're the Chicago Bears and you just whip people up front, it's kind of like everybody's mentality in the modern NFL. You know, just keep everything in front of you and get stingy in the red zone when there's not as much room. That's almost what you have to do in the modern NFL.
What's the update on Fletcher Cox? I mean, I know there's no definitive black and white update with him, but obviously he's coming back from injury, and he's been much more quiet than Eagles fans had hoped he would be. Have you seen anything over the past couple days? Have you, assessing the game film now that we're significantly removed from that Packers game? Just any update on Fletcher Cox at all and what we can expect moving forward?
Well, I just think it was the lack of an off season. And essentially, the first couple games of the season were his preseason. So we talked a lot about the preseason and guys not playing. And Fletcher was a little bit different. He was held out partially because of the rehab, but partially for caution as well. So you're in this ramp-up period. And hopefully, as the weeks go by, he gets closer to being that dominant player that he was the past two seasons specifically. Haven't seen it yet. It's not bad by any stretch of the imagination, but it's not close to what you expect from Fletcher Cox.
Yeah, and I guess at the quarter pole of the season, we could anticipate him kind of raising the level of play. They're going to need it, obviously, because as we've kind of chronicled, the guy next to him is now to the third guy next to him. What about Jernigan and the potential of getting him back anytime soon? Is that something that they're kind of counting on, or do you think they're kind of looking around to beef up that spot next to Fletcher?
No, I think they're counting on it, but they also realize it's a best case scenario week injury.
Yeah.
Worst case, probably 6 weeks. So you got to fight through it. And hopefully when he gets back, you have a sort of domino effect in the fact that you have a guy who's proven the issues with Tim are injury related. And the herniated disc last year that essentially wiped out a season for the most part. And now you have this issue. And even if you go back to the Super Bowl year, when he got the big contract, when he got the big extension, it's about the first 6 or 7 games, then he had an ankle injury, and he wasn't the same after that. So I do think it's fair to be worried about his durability at this stage. But when he's out there, he's a pretty good player. And when he's out there, that means you knock Hassan Ridgeway down a peg, you knock Akeem Spence down a peg, and that's better. So that's your goal, is to get slightly better, and they have to hold down the fort until he's back.
I want to go back to the corners real fast, and Sidney Jones, I want to kind of get your take on where he is, what he is. I mean, he was a guy that was thought to be a top 15 pick, and, the injury, and he's always been kind of had something. It's a hamstring. And we kind of pontificated earlier about, well, it seems that he gets beat, and then right after he leaves the game with a hamstring almost every single week. That seems to be the case. But if he's like kind of all right to play next week, like, does that kind of rate? Like, what have you formulated an opinion on who and what he is?
Well, I think as a player, I think you have to be a little disappointed, to be honest. And the biggest red flag to me is just speed at outside corner. Typically, when you talk about grading guys that high. And make no mistake, I mean, everybody had him graded as a top 20 pick. Most had him top 15. So he was a high-level prospect. And typically when you're talking about outside corners, that means they can run. And I haven't seen that from Sidney Jones. I really haven't. He's constantly being outrun. And you see a couple weeks ago by Marvin Jones, who that's not his forte. He's not a speed guy. He's a route runner. And he's crafty, and and I always say everybody's fast in the NFL. So you're relating to not the average person, but other NFL players. And I'm stunned by how easily he's outrun by most receivers in this league. So I think from right there, you got to start tempering your expectations. Maybe the draft people got it a little bit wrong. And then we just talked about durability with Jernigan. And you guys mentioned with Sidney, look, the torn Achilles, you kind of, that's just something that happens. And it was obviously terrible luck for him. But you're right. And you go back to when Peter King was embedded with Sean Payton, and he got to see his game planning. And 3 of the first 8 plays were to go at Sidney Jones, and they felt he couldn't hold up from a physical standpoint. So that tells you 2 things. A, he was coming off a hamstring, so they understood that he's not going to fight through it. And B, he's not physical to begin with. So I think that's fair to say. And it's still early. He can still turn things around, but you're starting to wonder if you're ever going to see that upside as a player.
Yeah, and I wonder if the team feels the same way you do in that regard. And if they do, what does that mean behind him? I mean, are they souring on Darby once he's healthy? Are they hopeful that Mills returns and kind of gives them a shot in the arm? Is Douglas kind of upped his status up the depth chart? I mean, I find there to be a lot of questions that really need to be kind of discussed in that defensive secondary room.
Yeah, the only one who has outperformed what was expected is Rasul Douglas, and he's the only one who's sort of trending in a positive direction. Now, the Eagles have a ton of confidence as a player of Ronald Darby. The coaching staff I'm talking about, they feel he's their best corner, and they don't think anyone is particularly close. I think his issue from their standpoints are coming back from the ACL, feeling comfortable. So I do think there's hope there that ultimately this could be a little bit of a silver lining, him missing time with a hamstring, because he can get that knee feeling a little better, can rehab that a little bit longer, and maybe he's more confident in it when he comes back. And then Avonte Maddox as well. I mean, Avonte that might have been one of his worst games as a professional before he got injured. He was not playing well either. So I think of all the corners, the only one that has played up to and exceeded expectations is Rasul Douglas. Yeah, I mean, I think the Eagles are very hopeful that Jalen Mills can come back on the PUP list to week 6, and they have a 5-week window where he can practice. And once he starts practicing, you have 21 days to bring him on the active roster. Hey, Jim trusts him. He knows he's a physical player. We talked about some of the issues with physicality. He's a good red zone player. So, yeah, if he's healthy, I know fans are not going to like that, but Jalen's going to be in the mix.
John, you bring up physicality, and I wanted to ask you about, Derek Barnett, because last year he only had 2 penalties. This year, only 4 games in, he has 5 already, and it seems like he's potentially, I'm not knocking him, I love how he plays, but we know today's NFL and how they call it. Is he gaining a reputation? Does he need to tread lightly? Do you fear him getting ejected or suspended for a crucial game down the road if he continues down this path, or is that just a little bit overblown?
No, it's real. You just saw it with Vontaze Burfict. You've seen it in the past with Andrew Sendejo, and you had people even in Philadelphia calling for him to be suspended for hitting his own player. When you have a reputation, it not only costs you extra money, but it means you're susceptible to suspensions further down the line. And in Burfict's case, as significant as it gets. I don't think Derek's at that point. I do think, I mean, from a coordinator's perspective and a coach's perspective, they always preach to the players, control what you can control. And the coaches have kind of taken that view. And that's just, again, what part of the modern NFL is. You're going to get hit 15-yard hits. And you're going to get these penalties. And you got to overcome them. And it's just part of what's mixed in to the strategy now. Because you know this is going to affect games and affect drives and allow teams to score points. So you do want to make your players mindful of it, but you also don't want to gear back on what makes them good players. And in Barnett's case, everyone talks about his motor, and it never stops. I don't know if you want to take that away from him. So I think that's more of a league problem than an individual player problem. But you can certainly develop a reputation, no question about that.
Hey, John, do we anticipate seeing more of Camus this week? I don't know that we saw any of him last week. Was he just kind of active as a emergency, or do you think he's takes over and gets the full reps?
Well, it's interesting. When the Eagles first signed Zach Brown, and I thought that's the way it would happen because he's such a veteran player. He knows how to play. You know what he is. There's really no questions about him as a player, but you know the limitations as well. So I thought they would default to him once you got into the real bullets flying, so to speak, and that's what's happened. Now, part of it was due to Camus' injury. I would have been more interested to see if he got through training camp healthy because he was that second linebacker. He's a better coverage guy. And maybe they would have flipped the switch and got Camus out there. And maybe it becomes a bit of a game plan thing. And if you need a run stopper, you use Zach as the second linebacker. If you need a pass coverage guy, you use Camus. Maybe that's how Jim will go about it. But and they use the big nickel a lot. So it makes that second linebacker position not as important as well.
Right.
Because I think they're more comfortable with Malcolm and Ronnie and Sendejo on the field than that second linebacker, at least when it's an obvious passing situation. So there's a lot of ways you can go about it, but that MCL sprain certainly put Camus back a little bit, and it's not surprising he wasn't getting starting level snaps in his first game back. I assume they would incrementally increase.
John, if you thought the football on Sunday was bad, how would you characterize what you saw last night?
Well, I was telling Josh, I mean, just when I think I see the worst offensive line I've ever seen in my life, another one comes along. And I don't think we're ever going to get lower than Cincinnati.
So they are the worst offensive line in football, you believe?
I do believe that. Miami can give them a run for the money. Arizona is certainly amongst the bottom five still. Man, there are a lot of bad offensive lines in this league. I've talked about it a lot with you guys. When people think the Eagles are struggling on the offensive line, I almost chuckle. I really do. Because you don't know they don't realize how bad the rest of these offensive lines are. And when you see it up close like that, I mean, when you have a bad offensive line, you can't get anything done. And best example of that from a good team standpoint is either Houston or Minnesota. A couple good teams, not great teams, terrible offensive lines. You saw it this week for both teams. It doesn't matter how many playmakers you have. If you can't block anybody, you can't get them in the football.
Ain't that the truth, man?
Amen.
Ain't that the truth? It was bad last night, painful. And I, we opened up today by saying, like, I read last night people immediately trade A.J. Green, Geno Atkins, like anybody who has a name that's somewhat recognizable. the knee-jerk reaction is get rid of anybody who has any talent on those teams.
Yeah, and I think that's, comes from obviously baseball and basketball. I don't think that's how you do it in the NFL. I mean, you don't want to give up your best players who are in the prime of their careers, because you can turn around things quickly in this league. I always say, if you get 2 offensive linemen, 2, that's it. 2 out of the 5 who play at a high level and can kind of make up for the deficiencies around them, all of a sudden you can scheme around things and start getting things done. So the assumption that everybody's going to tank, that's pervasive in modern sports, and it's not going to work in the NFL.
It's just crazy that that's
not enough good quarterbacks.
It's crazy that that's just now the accepted response to my team doesn't appear to be very good. I just want to go down that route. That seems to be
It seems like the lazy
Blame it
route
on your
now.
boy. He's teaching in Stanford right now. I think that's what he's teaching. He's teaching all these people.
I like it.
That's the only way to do it.
It's
and
I
really,
always said, John, I was not a fan of what they were doing. I just understood why they were doing it. I don't like it, but I got it.
Hinkie died for our sins.
Well, and I think it's easier to do in basketball, obviously.
Yeah. But it's now an accepted practice by fan bases, where the fan bases just say, we got no shot, let's just lose.
Yeah, and I think you really do have to separate the sports, because, again, you see it. You can bring in, if you think, for instance, Trevor Lawrence is going to, as a lot of people do, 2 years from now is going to be one of the best quarterback prospects, and you want to go down that road. Well, if you put Cincinnati's offensive line in front of them, you're going to have David Carr. I don't care who it is. I just said it. If you can't block, you can't do anything. So this is not a sport where you can just get one player, no matter how good that player is, and he's going to turn everything around. It's just, people in the industry call it the ultimate team game, and it is. I mean, quarterbacks are the most important. There's no question about that. But if you don't have other pieces, you can't win.
John McMullen, every day, 4 o'clock, football at 4, 97.3 ESPN at JF McMullen. And, of course, tomorrow the Eagles really start to focus on this Jets team. We'll dive into the matchup and more. And, of course, the NFL Week 5 is on the horizon. Johnny Mac, appreciate it, pal.
All right, thank you, guys.
And Johnny Mac, like all guests, appeared via the Boardwalk Honda hotline.